Hey, y'all. Welcome to Questions You Didn't Ask. Did you know that this very spot could be showcasing your business or event? Whether it's an audio ad on our podcast or a visual ad on our new YouTube station, or even both, we've got the space for you. Niasha Fray Consulting is reaching a growing audience of over 1,000 leaders who are passionate about health equity, social justice, and civil rights activism. These are professionals just like you, working across higher education, research, healthcare, nonprofit, government, and even public health sectors. If you're ready to get your message in front of a dedicated and engaged audience, send me an email at niashafrayconsultingllc@gmail.com. Let's talk about how we can help you connect with the people who need to hear about your services and products that advance health equity and wellness. Don't miss out. Get in the mix and let's make an impact together. Welcome back to Questions You Didn't Ask. I'm Niasha Fray, joined again by the brilliant Dr. Elena Roberts as we continue Sankofa and Solidarity, uncovering Black and Native legacies for health equity. Let's dive back in. We didn't get a chance to talk about land rights, right? Even when we think about the Northeast, right? The states are really small. You start to come further down the Southeast, they start to get bigger. But then when you move west, they're huge, right? And so one of the things that was interesting about your book was, as we mentioned before, the American government found a way to impose its will on the Native nations, right, to free and emancipate their slaves, which the Native nations would not have done without that power move, right? They fought it. And one of the reasons why they fought it was because what came with that was the 40 acres requirement, right? For each of the formerly enslaved people, or maybe families. I don't know if it was a family unit or individuals. Feel free to clarify me, but they actually received the 40 acres. When we think about the vastness of what's on the other side of the Mississippi, that is a lot more like doable because the landmass is larger. And how you talked about how that land formation, that land acquisition or allocation, and the emancipation of those formerly enslaved Africans led to the development of states like Oklahoma. You also talked about how it was kind of a foundational element for the establishment of communities like Tulsa, right? And so can you tell my audience a little bit more about the role African and Black freedmen played in reshaping post-slavery America? And we hear about Tulsa, but we do not hear about the Black people who were formerly enslaved by Native tribes. Can you share a little bit about how those formerly enslaved people reshaped what we know today to be America?
So if we're thinking about the way like a textbook is divided, I mean, it's been a long time since I was in school, but I'm thinking about this all the time with my college students. The Civil War kind of gets, a portion, and then you have the kind of Western expansion portion of the book. But this is actually all happening at the same time. So during the Civil War, the United States is also thinking about expanding west. The Homestead Act is passed during the war, 1862. And so as white settlers are at the same time, fighting a war in some aspects, they're also thinking about how can I kind of create my own new home somewhere in the West, West meaning, west of the Mississippi River. And so for people in Indian Territory, which is what eventually becomes the state of Oklahoma, they are in what at first the United States thought of as like, oh, like it's dry there, like no one wants to live there. Fine, Native Americans, move there from the Southeast. This is where we're going to push you because we don't care. We're never going to move there. 20 years later, they're like, oh, actually, maybe we should move there. And so they begin pressuring Indian nations to give up some of their land there. But it's after the Civil War that the United States says we can use basically as an excuse the fact that Native nations fought in the Civil War, some on the side of the Confederacy, and say, if you want to reestablish connections and positive relationships with us, the government that you now have to deal with again, you got to give up some land. And this is how they also push through the emancipation of formerly enslaved people in these Indian nations. And so the way that Native nations owned land traditionally was communally, meaning, a tribe kind of thought of a piece of land as their own, and individuals could settle wherever they wanted on that land, and they could, farm wherever they wanted, and as much as they could farm was, their portion of that land. And that's what the 5 tribes were still doing in Indian territory. But the United States didn't like that. They didn't like it as a social construct because they didn't like the idea that Native people weren't kind of subscribing to Native or Euro-American norms. But they also didn't like it on a political and economic level because that meant that white people couldn't come in and kind of buy their own section of that land if they wanted to. And so part of the treaties that they make after the Civil War is, free those Black people, make those Black people part of your nation, and then also divide that land that you own into individual parcels like, white Americans do. We have personal property. That's the way we make and pass down, wealth. We want you to do that too now. And so they came in and surveyed all of this huge amount of land. And then they gave that, well, they didn't give it to. So they bought some of that to then use for things like the Homestead Act or things like the land runs. And then the rest of that it stayed within those Indian nations, except now everyone had individual title to land. So, you asked about, does every individual get one or it's the family? And it's every individual. So my grandfather's dad, he had a piece of land, 40 acres. All of his brothers, all of his 11 brothers, all had their own portions of land as well, sometimes right by each other, sometimes in like random different places. And also every Native person had the same thing. And so that's how eventually you're able to kind of open up these various states, because then Indian territory becomes 2 halves. So one where Indian nations are still present, one where white settlers have been allowed to live, that becomes the state of Oklahoma. And then eventually the United States has enough white settlers there to then say, okay, now we want to make this a state. Native nations fight back against this. They say, we want to live here as our own governments. This is what you promised us. We are sovereign nations who have treaties with the United States going back till your very founding. They try to actually create their own state. It's called the state of Sequoia. They create signatures, like they have conventions. At the same time, African Americans from the United States are coming into this space and saying, we want to actually build our own state here too. Like, we want to be free from discrimination that we're facing in the US South. And so there are Black politicians, there are African American leaders, also Frederick Douglass, who are saying, this is the space where we should create kind of our own example of what African Americans can do once we're free. And Indian territory really kind of becomes a battleground, and also a space where all these different groups are envisioning like what could be for themselves. I mean, and white people are part of this too. White people are coming from the South, where the hierarchy that allowed for racial slavery also kept poor white people from being able to do much, like not having many opportunities as well. That's kind of always what I teach my white students, that racism also does not help you, a white person. Like, it also creates this hierarchy in which you are not benefiting unless you're part of the 1%. And so really, this is, I think, a good encapsulation of what the United States becomes, because it is a fight between these three main groups, Black, Native, and white Americans, over land, and who has, the right to claim this land, who has title to this land, who is better, who is more civilized. And so in kind of all this mess, places like, Tulsa's Greenwood district are able to flourish because for the time period between when it becomes the state of Oklahoma and then in the early days of the state of Oklahoma, for about a decade or two, you have still this opportunity. Like, you still have the ability to function without all of these white settlers crowding around you with a hardened racial hierarchy. But it's when you get all these white settlers and you get the might of the state and the idea that okay, now this is a settled place. This is no longer kind of the western frontier where anything is possible. Now we need to put into place the things that already exist on the East Coast. That's when kind of the white violence really ratchets up. And that's when you get the Tulsa Massacre, because all these white people are coming here and saying, why is this Black person doing better than me?
If you're enjoying the show as much as we love creating it, consider showing your support by buying us a cup of coffee. Visit buymeacoffee.com/Niasha Fray O. That's buymeacoffee.com/Niasha Fray O. All one word. Each cup is just $5, and every single one helps us continue to produce, develop, and sustain the high quality content you've come to expect from Questions You Didn't Ask. Thank you for your continued support, and let's keep the conversation going. Right. I came out here to assert myself in order to rise above my own white poverty that enslaved me informally on the East Coast. And I definitely wanted to be seen as arriving to other white folks. But I can't do that if there are Black people that are doing better than me.
Mm-hmm.
So the answer is destroy it. Yay! Let's bomb it. Let's terrorize these people and put them in their place. Right. Yep. So I'm saying that with a smile and I'm laughing, but obviously I'm describing something that was terrible, that was horrible, that was violent, that was what we call domestic terrorism, right? And with that, you also mentioned how in that early push west, how people of African descent, right, were able to acquire massive amounts of land. With that came wealth building opportunities. And with those wealth building opportunities came the development of places like Tulsa. From my, somewhat limited understanding of history, acquiring that type of land was almost impossible in the original colonies, right? On the East Coast. And so there is an assumption that I'm making, and we know what assumptions do, so I'm going to limit my assumptions, is that those Black folks were doing better, right, than the people that were in the original colonies or east of the Mississippi, right? And then there's also this weird thing. Again, my brain went poof, when, you know what I'm about to say, when Frederick Douglass, our beloved and dear Frederick Douglass, revealed himself as being human, wholeheartedly human, aka imperfect. Imperfect in that he was making a political statement and a political move that seemed counter to his original thesis, right? And that so I will leave it there, that, and let you talk a little bit more about what his motivation was, maybe a little bit about the context in which he's, making a statement about what's happening on the west side of the Mississippi and what opportunities are there.
So when we talk about African Americans and land, the phrase, the motto, whatever, that a lot of people know, even if they don't know more of the deeper history, is the idea of 40 acres and a mule. Like, it's been in multiple rap songs, most recently in Kendrick Lamar's Super Bowl song, which was amazing. And this comes from the idea that African Americans deserve something, like anything, after these generations of free labor in the United States. And this comes from like a real life historical incident or episode, when during the Civil War, African Americans start basically following the United States Army as it's on its way through the South, winning, sometimes losing, winning also. And the generals are really kind of saying, we can't house all these Black people, like we can't feed them. We don't even always have enough for ourselves. What are we going to do with all these people? They talked to Abraham Lincoln, they talked to Ulysses S. Grant, various people. And then finally someone has the idea, well, why don't we ask African Americans what they want? Like, what can we do for you guys? And a group of reverends and other politicians or political leaders kind of say, you can give us a home, like you can give us our own land. Like clearly we already know how to take care of ourselves. We've been taking care of white people. And so what we want is to have something of our own.
Right.
And at this point, this is 1864, there are multiple slaveholders who have fled their, what is this called? Plantations.
Right.
fled their plantations. And in the South Carolina Sea Islands and Georgia, they say, like, can we just kind of have this land that these people are no longer living on?
Right.
And the government and one of the generals, Sherman, says, yes, we are going to do what's called the field order, which is kind of it's not an official proclamation, but it's something that's happening during wartime to make things easier, basically. And so this order basically gives them to right to 40 acres of land. And so they're able to plant that land. They build schools with the help of people who come from the north. They build churches. And so they're finally creating communities, free from slaveholders and also from, discrimination. It's great. Then after the Civil War, President Lincoln dies. President Andrew Jackson takes over, or Johnson. And Johnson does not like this. Johnson, who is a Southerner, is very uncomfortable with the fact that Black people could have land that was taken from a white person. And so he tells Congress, you got to make them give that land back. And so for the most part, they do. So this kind of experiment that has shown that African Americans can successfully farm, surprise, and take care of themselves still doesn't end up mattering in the end, because the United States is very uncomfortable with the idea of taking private property from any white person and giving it to a Black person. There are still some African Americans who are able to buy land throughout the South. There's this great book, I can't remember the name of it right now, but the author is Bria Baker, and she talks about the landowners throughout the South, some of whom have still passed that land down to their descendants today, which is amazing. But generally in the South, racism doesn't allow people to take ownership of land and stay on it. Usually, even if some person is able to kind of amass the capital needed to buy land, they're scared off of it because there's violence. Their life is threatened, the life of their family is threatened. And so they're moving north, they're moving west, or they're staying in the South and becoming a sharecropper. But in the West, there's a different opportunity, because a lot of the land out there is still held by Native Americans, and white people don't respect Native Americans and their claims to land in the same way they do white Americans. And so what we see with the 5 tribes is that sort of disrespect, not as bad as it gets with people who are in the further West, like the Pacific Northwest, and then places like what is now Arizona, Montana, etc. The 5 tribes, because they are respected still as these, quote unquote, civilized peoples, they do have treaties that allow them to sell their land to the US. So they do still make money, a low amount of money, but amount of money from that land sale. And they do still have some control over that. But there is that provision that gives people like my family land, because for Republicans who are in Congress and who wanted to give African Americans in the South land, but didn't have the votes, can say, well, this is Native Americans. Like, we don't care about that. Like, let's kind of do what we weren't able to do for Black people in the South here in the West.
Right.
And so they're able to put that in that treaty that goes through. Then you also have African Americans who are able to kind of come together and unite to, pull their money to buy land. So a lot of the Black towns in Oklahoma being the state with the most Black towns at the turn of the 20th century, that comes from, Black people who have gotten wealthy and who kind of buy a whole pool of land and then subdivide that land so that African Americans who don't have as much money can purchase that. And so this is why people like Frederick Douglass see the West really as kind of the place where land ownership is possible. Like, clearly there wasn't enough kind of white desire to actually give equality to African Americans in the South. He sees that, he's realistic. He says, maybe it's not going to happen here, but it could happen in the West because Black people, they know how to take care of this land. They are like you white people. They are productive. They're smart. Like, they want to farm. They want to be, good citizens, unlike Native Americans. And so the interesting thing about Douglass's statement is that he he feels it's necessary almost to denigrate Native Americans in order to make this point about African Americans.
That's a wrap on this episode of Questions You Didn't Ask. I'm Niasha Fray, and it's been a privilege to speak with award-winning author Dr. Elena Roberts. Join us next week as we continue our series, Sankofa and Solidarity, uncovering Black and Native legacies for health equity. See you then.